It's a collective action problem that you cannot change. And I think it's good because if you look back at any point in time over the last 5,000 years, if you were to say, no, stop this technology, 99.99% of the time, you'd be wrong and you'd be hurting human progress.
All right, Quinn, thank you so much for joining the Collective Intelligence podcast. Would love to first have you just give us a quick background on who you are and what brought you to Sourcegraph.
So my name is Quinn Slack. I am not at Slack. I am at Sourcegraph, and I've been a developer all my life. That's what led to Sourcegraph. But if you go back before that, I was working on a bunch of big open source projects like Chromium and OpenSSL and curl. And right now, if you do curl-help, you'll see one of the flags I added. And to work in these big code bases, you had to download all the code. I was trawling through it in my editor, Emacs. It was a pain. And I started to set up these code search tools. At the time, this was 2009. It was OpenGrok, which looked like it was from even a decade prior. But I found these code search tools be so helpful in actually understanding these massive code bases. And that was something that carried through to my first job after college, along with my co-founder at Sourcegraph, now Beyond. We were thrust into these big banks where our job was basically write software as fast as you could. And it was this amazing kind of job at Palantir where we got to wear the business suit by day and everyone thought we were the business people. We'd hear about the business problems from these top 5 banks in the US. They'd all go home. We'd change into sweatpants and go code in the conference room until like 2 a.m., show up the next morning. And they thought that some overseas team wrote this code. But actually, no, we were able to iterate so fast on the business and technical problems. But the biggest pain we had is it was so hard to figure out how this big bank's code base worked, even to figure out who owned this code or why is this broken, or if we change this, what's going to break. And so I thought back to when I had code search on those open source projects I was working on. Beyond, my co-founder, had been at Google, and he thought back to this amazing internal tool at Google that's called code search. And we said, we wish we had these kind of code search tools in these big banks. In fact, it would make all of their software development so much easier, so much more effective. It would mean that people wouldn't need to reinvent the wheel constantly. And it would mean that, essentially you could be 10 to 100 times more effective as a software developer. So that's why we started Sourcegraph, to bring that kind of code search that we found so valuable to every company in the world. And that was in 2013. And of course, everything worked perfectly. We never made a single mistake. And here we are. Not actually, but here we are more than 10 years later, and it's been an absolute thrill.
Okay. So let's get into, typically entrepreneurs will kind of rattle around a couple ideas that they're thinking before they start their company. What were some other alternative ideas that you were thinking about? Or was it always just Sourcegraph?
Well, after Palantir, I started another company called Blend, and that was more directly about what we were doing at Palantir. It was to help big banks basically process mortgages, and so that you as a consumer, if you need a mortgage, you could do it entirely on your phone. And mortgages are one of the most important financial transactions anyone does. There's so much opportunity, so much money in there, and Blend has done very well. It went public, and what I learned about myself personally is I really love code. And as much as I love mortgages, and they are very interesting, I love code more. And I would never feel fully satisfied working in some vertical that wasn't my passion. I mean, even today, with 200 people at Sourcegraph, with significant scale, you're going to find me coding after 8 p.m. on nights and weekends. And so I could just not get away from my passion. But now I've found this situation where I get to see how all these other companies are doing software development. I get to do software development. I have a good excuse for why I get to do it in my current job. So I'm glad that, although Blend was very successful and still is, glad that ultimately ended up on this. And once I got out of Blend, talked to Beyond, my co-founder here, and there's really no question about what we would build. It was code search, and that just absolutely clicked for both of us. So there were really no pivots along the way from when we started Source.
So, I often have a problem thinking through recruiting really great technical talent to vertical software. So it's pretty easy when you're building maybe a caching technology to just go to Stanford, go to MIT, and just say, dial for dollars and say, hey, I read your paper, you're really great in the space. Do you want to come work for this company that will do something very similar to what you do now? In vertical software, how do you get engineers and technical talent to get excited about mortgages? I mean, it's a very big company, very successful, but what were some key insights that you think you took away from that experience?
Well, with a vertical software company, you do have something that appeals to a lot of software developers, which is they can just focus on code. They don't need to be that close to the customer. They're going to have product managers and salespeople that kind of coalesce everything into some blocks that they can take off in Jira. They can really focus on the craft of code. And I think that is a fully coherent worldview, and a lot of people really like that. I think that there's more stability because vertical companies tend to be lower variance. You know that if you put in a certain number of hours to fix this problem in the medical space, you can probably build something valuable. And that appeals to a lot of people. That's actually most software companies in the world. That's most software in the world. It's actually the horizontal thing, like what we do, where every company that has code, no matter what industry they're in, they need Sourcegraph. That is riskier. That's higher variance. But that is the kind of thing where we have to find developers that are a very different breed. We have to find developers who love building a product that they themselves use and that can have that feedback cycle in their head as they're building it to see, is this actually good? It's developers who got to go get on a plane and go meet with the customer because actually they can have these really high fidelity conversations with customers. That's the much harder kind of developer to find.
Okay, I see. So maybe let's go back to Sourcegraph, those early days. Okay, so you're talking to your co-founder. Walk us through the first 30 days. How do you go about testing out this hypothesis? Well, I guess you kind of already have proof points that this is a key problem to solve, but what do you do during those first 30 days to prove out the hypothesis?
So, here's the picture. I just moved out of an apartment to move in with my wife. So I had an extra room in an apartment with a bunch of friends from college. We took the bed out, we put in 2 desks from IKEA, got some monitors, and we're coding nonstop. And the first 30 days were amazing because we were actually able to get a very basic kind of code search that we started to be able to use ourselves while we were building it. It's kind of like building the airplane while flying, but it actually, took off in the first 30 days. And there was a moment in the first 2 weeks where it clicked for me, and that stayed with me ever since. And that was when I was coding Sourcegraph, and I used Sourcegraph to find that the thing I was doing, actually someone else had done already in open source. And there's a beautiful open source library that saved me the next 2 weeks. And so 2 weeks in, I felt that it already had given me 2 weeks of time savings. And that's like a perpetual motion machine or something. It just absolutely clicked for me. And that has sustained me, even though there's been so many times that it was tough and it took us a lot longer to get to the first customer than we were expecting. But it was that spark that sustained us. And I'm really glad we found that.
So you are, coding on the couch for the first 30 days. What are alternative perspectives that that people are taking when you're telling people about Sourcegraph, that they're saying like this XYZ about your assumptions are false, and you believe those assumptions are true, and then you get some sort of piece of data to prove that your assumptions are true?
Well, with horizontal software, it's harder because generally if you're building something that's horizontal that tons of people could use, tons of industries can use, you either are building something that's only 5 or 10% better than something that exists today, and you're going to get a lot of, hey, how are you different than this? Or you're building something that everyone is like, I don't know why I'd use that. But when there's such a broad population of potential users, you can find them anywhere in the world. And we were in the latter category. There was no one who was doing code search at the time. And when we actually would try to convince specific people about it, investors or friends, they would say, I don't know why I'd use that. We did find some people that got it, people who had been at Google and who'd used code search, but for the most part, people thought that it was a crazy idea.
Why is that?
Well, they said, I don't know when I'd use that. I've been coding for 5 years or 20 years without anything like that. I don't know. It sounds like a behavior change. And why do you think that GitHub couldn't just do this? And all of those kinds of questions. It's a new kind of software that they did not have in their workflow. And most people when they're pitched some idea for some new kind of software that's going to change their workflow, they're not like, oh, that's a great idea. It takes a while to sink in. They got to use it. Just like I had to use it. I had to get that spark.
The same thing happened to me with GenAI code tools. I was like, why don't I just sort of copy paste it in ChatGPT? And I kind of habitualized myself on coding with ChatGPT, and I didn't realize just how much nicer it is just to have it nicely integrated into your editor. And so I just didn't want to change what I was doing. I was also just addicted to Stack Overflow, and I often think about how. Obviously there's different types of problems. There's, the hair on fire problem where someone is looking so far and wide for a solution like yours. And then there's this new paradigm shift where their life would be like 10x better if they would just try it. And I often wonder, like, how does one catalyze those shifts? Because I think there's a lot of GenAI code tools, for example, that's probably their biggest barrier to adoption. It's not that GenAI won't improve their coding abilities. It's just that people don't even want to try in the first place. How do you think about that behavior shift? Is it are there three prongs of attack such that Sourcegraph becomes the standard? Sourcegraph does conferences such that it becomes habitualized, and maybe Sourcegraph gives out free tools. Like, how do you conquer that idea of it's just a matter of behavior shift? Once they realize that this is a better way of doing it, then they'll start heavily using Sourcegraph.
It took us a long time to figure that out. And there are a few things that ultimately worked. One of the mistakes we made was we started by trying to get it to our other friends that had tiny startups. And one of the things about code search, and the reason why we started is because it helps if you have a big code base that's really messy. And a 3-person or 7-person startup doesn't really have that problem. And it felt like, well, maybe they have 10% of that problem, and so they'd have 10% of that need. And if they're friends with us, they'd use it. But that it doesn't work that way for horizontal software. And I'm actually really glad that we realized that, because the first few customers that you have dictate your entire company direction. And we made a very specific decision to stop trying to do that. We had some small consultancies, some small startups that were using it mainly as a favor to us. And I think if we kept pushing, we probably would have built a product that was very different. We probably would have pivoted. But we ended up sticking with the product that we wanted to build, that we had seen the need for inside these big banks. And we worked for basically another 3 or 4 years in mostly a void, other than a bunch of people that were using us for open source projects, where that's a sphere where everyone has to deal with a lot of big, messy code. Even if your company's code base is tiny, you're maybe for 5% of your time, you're having to trawl through open source code. So we did have that user validation, but it took another 3 or 4 years until we got the first customer, because we had to make it so that it would scale up to a big company's code base and that it would appeal to everyone in a big company. So our first customer was Uber and other companies like that. And there they have a ton of different programming languages. They have a ton of different developers with different preferences, and we needed to satisfy all these people. But once we had gotten that, then there were not other code search startups, period. There were certainly no other code search startups that were able to go and serve the enterprise, serve thousands of users, and make the devs love it. And that's when everything started to take off.
Okay, so oftentimes you see that the go-to-market shift is small to medium-sized first, and then inflect upwards towards larger enterprises. And one of the key issues, particularly when you pair large enterprise with a developer solution, is that in insourcing those developer tools, why don't I just build this myself?
Right. Because the code is very sensitive, and any new tool has to overcome a really big barrier for the company to want to take the risk of bringing something in, or even going through the security approval process to try something new.
Right. So I guess, why wouldn't some of these larger, Uber, has a phenomenal track record of building sort of developer-centric systems to bolster some of their, ride-sharing services. Like, what calculus did they do to say, we don't want to allocate a group of engineers to bring this in-house, because code search tool is obviously going to be really important for them Why not? Why go with you guys? What do you think the calculus is there for them?
This is another thing that we didn't quite realize the importance of when we were starting, but it's one thing for a company to build in-house some internal tool that's not a daily workflow tool where there's not a lot of end users constantly using it. But Sourcegraph Code Search is something that you are using all the time as an end user. It has a user interface. It has to be designed. It has to be slick and fast and has to have user onboarding. And those are all the kinds of things that internal tools generally shy away from, because actually there's a ton of work to do that. In addition to that, there's a lot of technical scale and complexity, but I think it's really the user interface that made it so that people would look at this kind of problem and say, yeah, there's no way that we internally could or should do all of that work.
Okay, so then let's break that down. So what 3 components would they need to build out in order to do that work? Like let's say we're Uber engineers. We're in a whiteboarding session. We're sort of making the calculus. We go to Sourcegraph. We just had a conversation with them. We're good engineers. We can do this ourselves. We can, why do we need these guys? So we go to the whiteboard. We draw 3 key buckets of things we need to get done if we want to build Sourcegraph in-house. What are those 3 key buckets first? And then we'll get into why it's so difficult to build that.
Yeah, we actually just had a very well-known tech company in SF about 6 months ago come back to us and say, hey, we actually tried to build this in-house and we decided not to, so we do want to go with Sourcegraph. And the 3 rough buckets they called out, one was the UI. It's just a lot of UI work, a lot of different ways to look at code, a lot of kind of visualizations of file tree, search results, filters, all that. That's one thing. Another is precise code intelligence. And this is being able to, just like in your editor, go to definition or find references across languages, across repositories. That's like a whole compilers team that you'd have to build, and you'd have to keep it up to date whenever the language changes, whenever you use a different build tool. And it's obvious that it makes sense for one company, us, to do that for everyone, because if everyone is using Ruby and Java, like not every company wants to build a compiler on their own. And then the third thing is all of the stuff that is kind of a niche use case, like someone who wants to have a Google Alerts type thing from search, someone who wants charts for management dashboards from search. All of these other things you can kind of build on the API, we had already built them, and it would just been a long time for them to build these kinds of tools on it.
So I think when you're thinking about should I build a startup around this larger enterprise focused software, it's one, is this a mission critical tool? 2, the steps that they would need to take in order to build this tool would just take a long time for them to do. Okay, so maybe the third question I have for you is how do you think about maintenance and customer requests? So oftentimes, one of the reasons why they bring it in-house is because if I don't like your tool and the way it's built in particular, and you don't respond to my feedback, then I'm kind of stuck with your tool instead of having control over it. How do you think about customer service or customer feedback in your development like cycles? For Sourcegraph, who collects that from the customer? How do you timeline that? Is there any sort of philosophy around on balancing? You have this list of to-dos that you need to get done for next year, this roadmap you've already met, you've already sort of built out, balancing that with sort of the demands of customers that happen every other day.
Yeah, with horizontal software, ideally, you have seen how you are able to solve this problem at a lot of other companies, and everyone does software development, mostly the same. They do software development across different companies, big, small, different industries, mostly the same. Then you look at how do different companies do hiring, or how do different companies build their factories? Those are very different processes. So as horizontal, we come into each new customer with a much stronger and more appealing opinion about how code search should work. So just off the bat, on day one, we should be in a better place. But we also made a decision to be focused on the enterprise because the nature of the problem that we picked is something that is only felt by the enterprise. So we listen, and we don't have kind of hundreds of thousands of customers that each have a tiny voice. We have a much smaller number of customers that have a bigger voice. We know who they are. We visit them in person. So they do have more of a say in us. But I really think like so much of it is about that user interface, because all it takes is for, some developers to say, hey, this internal tool that we built, the UI is really ugly. It's really clunky. Hey, there's this thing called Sourcegraph that I use for open source. It's got a much better UI. Can we just use that? And people get kind of frustrated if they're having to use some internal tool that's clearly worse just because their company is cheap in a sense, and they even know that it costs a lot of money to build an internal tool. So much of it is about the UI. And I've seen startups that build headless, like maybe a few wizards in a corner are using it, or there's no UI, or it's just a database. That is where companies, I think, really struggle with the build versus buy decision.
Yeah. Okay. So I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think it is also a function of developer experience. I mean, it's almost like you have, you provide the 401k, you provide free lunches, and you also make sure that your developers are happy by giving them the best of breed tools. And I think that's also another probably a key aspect here is like, how do you make the job of developer sort of as seamless as possible so that they can focus on what they need to handle as opposed to rebuilding internal tools that don't actually impact the end customer. So that also is another kind of key point that definitely makes sense. Okay, so we've adopted the tool. That's great. We're at a company and we made a decision. It's better to bring in Sourcegraph. Now we get a call. We get a call from GitHub. We get a call from some of the other competitors that are asking, "Hey, Sourcegraph, they're weak on X, Y, Z, and rip them out. You don't need them. Use us. We'll do X, Y, Z better." Who are those competitors who are saying that, or what? Maybe you just say in broadly what you think you do better than competitors, and why a user would be less incentivized to sort of rip out Sourcegraph.
Yeah. So naturally, everything attracts competition. What we hear from our customers is that, several things, that precise code intelligence, being able to see where is this thing called everywhere across all of our code, across repositories. That's a level of depth, technical depth in our product that no other code search tool does. And it's, clear how that is a ton of work. So it's not like just around the corner from someone. You'd see a lot of kind of open source work and artifacts of any other company that was trying to catch up to us there. And there's just none of that. That's one big thing. Another thing is we are universal. And this means, when we're talking to enterprises, it's very rare that they have all their code in one place. It is so common that they have some code in GitHub. They acquired a company using GitLab. Some devs have this old Bitbucket instance. We have customers with 160 different code hosts. We have customers with 600,000 repositories. And that just wouldn't fit on a single instance. And so once you have code that's scattered, then you need something that sits across all of it and searches. And so it's, think of the GitHub pitch. It's, they might go to a company and say, hey, we can give you code search in GitHub if you get all of your code in GitHub. And the first thing you're going to think is, yeah, that's a pretty self-interested statement from GitHub. And there's a reason why we don't have all the code in GitHub. And the GitHub rep is telling the company that, the GitLab rep, the Atlassian rep, and they're all competing. So whenever there's fragmentation, you have this universal play. And as we look ahead to AI, this becomes relevant. We have established a lot of credibility as a company that can work with all the different tools for code hosting that our customers use. And now we hear from customers that, they use Datadog for observability. They use Splunk for logs. They deploy to AWS and Azure. And that's where, as we have gotten into this new code AI world as well on top of code search, that universal play becomes even more important. Because I think you kind of know that GitLab's code AI is going to work great if you're using all the GitLab features. GitHub's code AI, GitHub Copilot, is going to work great if you're using everything on Azure. And anything that's using the tools that you choose, the Datadogs, the Splunks, the AWSs, that's going to be kind of a second-class citizen in these code AI tools built by the code hosts. So this universal play is really important. And I think that's a really underappreciated kind of differentiator for startups. And the reason why is it's really hard to build because we had to, before we even got our first customer, we had to build support for multiple code hosts. And we would not have gotten there if we were just building it for our friends' 3-person companies because they're all on GitHub and we never would have found this huge differentiator.
Whoa. Okay. So you built out Sourcegraph for different platforms before you even launched.
Yeah,
You
we
didn't
could
just
not
build it
have
for
gotten the
GitHub.
first customer because you cannot find an enterprise hardly that has all their code in one place.
So that's a really fascinating point. I think HashiCorp had a very similar approach where they were just differentially advantaged in that they could be multi-cloud. I think Snowflake had a similar advantage of being sort of multi-cloud, although they host their compute on. But the point is that they have these companies have differential advantage merely by the fact that they're not sort of the few key vendors, and you can host on a variety
Yeah.
of environments. That is super fascinating.
Yeah. And same thing with models. I think a lot of startups are saying we will work with any model. And sometimes they think of it as a choice thing. And some people want choice, but what people and companies really want is they want the best. And if you're building a product on top of LLMs, it is this beautiful situation where you're like in this massive coliseum and you're spectating, and there's tens of billions of dollars from the biggest companies in the world that are all fighting it out just for a tiny little advantage. And that's, I mean, amazing. And they also have their own products that compete with you. But how long is, XYZ company's model going to be state of the art? Maybe for 6 months, and they spent $10 billion on it. And then, ABC company is going to pull ahead. And as an independent company that offers this universal LLM support, you can commit to your customers that they will always be able to use the very best model. And that is so powerful.
Do you think that will always be the case, though? Do you think that we'll always have these LM routers that sort of pick the most optimized LM for the job, or do you think that perhaps we'll converge? Like the Intel x86 chip has 60% market share, at least last time I checked. Like the market kind of converged to one chip. I mean, do you think that models will be similar, where we'll sort of that eventually, with all the spend, one person will sort of take the lead and run away with it, just like Google did? Or do you think it'll always be this multi-model future?
Well, I think in either way, you win with a universal approach. So let's say that there is one company that just runs away and has an incredible lead over every other model company. I mean, that is a very weird future. That's a future in which these $100 billion bets of all the other biggest companies in the world that are the top 5 or top 10 market cap companies, where they're basically crumbling. And I think there's a lot of smart people that are working to make that not happen. And you even think about the mechanism. If one of those companies sees that happening, then it would be in their interest to pay $2 billion to acquire one of the leading geniuses at this company that's pulling ahead. And they can do that. I mean, it's a free country. So I think it's really hard to imagine one company having such a dominating lead out there. So then let's say that everyone kind of achieves, rough parity. Then in that case, I think you have, as a startup offering a tool built on LLMs, you're going to have them competing and driving the price down of this fundamental substrate that you need to build your product on. And that means that, you can offer it more cheaply. I think the more likely thing is kind of like in semiconductors, you're going to see a lot of fabs that can create roughly comparable chips, and those have zero pricing power. It's an incredibly low margin competitive industry. And you're going to have some fabs like TSMC that spend massive amounts of capital to make something that is 10 or 20% ahead, and they can have a sustainable 10 or 20% advantage. That in some applications is actually worth paying for. Apple, for example, pays for that. I think the difference with AI models is it's not just going to be one, TSMC. I think you have companies that have seen this game unfold and they do not want to be left behind. So you have at least 3 massive companies that have basically, unlimited war chests, and they're not going to let, a single one of them even stay 20% ahead sustainably.
Okay. Yeah, that's a super fascinating picture. Okay. Another key question I was wondering is on AI integration. So, maybe you have your sort of code gen tool, you might have your search tool. How do you envision the integration of AI into the developer workflow over the next 5 years? What are people not talking about that are outside of code search or code gen? is there anything else that you think is going to happen in developer workflows that people aren't really talking about right now?
The thing that people aren't talking about is no one actually uses these tools. 5% of developers are using Code AI. And if you go on Twitter, if you're in San Francisco, it doesn't seem like that. I mean, even then, it's like 50%. You can find tons of people that aren't using this. But the actual adoption of Code AI is way lower than what you'd think if you're in the bubble and what it should be. And why is this? Well, it's because most developers work inside of companies. And most developers, companies haven't approved anything like this. They also just take a while to change their behavior. Even if you think that developer behavior is going to change faster than in any other wave, it still takes several years. And I think everyone knows this personally. Like you mentioned, when Copilot came out, that was like 2021? And it's not like everyone suddenly started using it. But now in hindsight, if you use it, you know that kind of autocomplete AI modality is really valuable. It turns out it wasn't that good when it first came out, and it took a while. But everyone is a late adopter relative to that first person who started using autocomplete in the editor. Because actually, it wasn't Copilot to begin with. It was Tab 9, and that was back in like 2016, 2017. So these things just take a lot longer than people appreciate. And there's two different kinds of ways you can build a startup in AI. You can either build it for that 1% of early adopters where all the buzz is on Twitter. Turns out there's a lot of noise there. That's really hard. You might win those hearts and minds for a few weeks, but then someone else is going to come out with something. The other thing is build it for the enterprise, where adoption is still lagging way behind where it should be and where most of the money, where most of the problems are. And that's what we've done.
I think the core problem that people have there, though, is that the sales cycles are so long that by the time the enterprise decides to buy your software, your startup is already dead. So I guess how do you maybe the solution is, hey, raise more VC funding, but is there anything that you'd say to sort of address the slower sales cycle?
Yeah, that's a problem if you built your company without that assumption. You can raise more money, or you could have some kind of services component, which is actually makes a lot more sense in the world of AI. If you're solving a problem, then put some humans behind it. That's what we did for in AI. Not we as in Sourcegraph. That's what everyone did with AI. The joke was that most AI in the 2010s was actually humans paid by VCs and presented as AI in end products. But there's a lot of ways that you could do that. And actually, think of let's say that you own a small software consulting firm, where today you are essentially charging big companies by the hour for software development labor. I think that kind of firm, that kind of person is in a really good position to be able to slowly make the transition to using Code AI. And they're actually best positioned to monetize the actual impact and benefit of Code AI.
Okay. Understood. Okay. So
but
I think
if anyone says, well, there's this big opportunity, but it's hard because the sales cycles are long, so I'm going to do something else. That's kind of like the person who's looking for their keys under the streetlight because that's where it's lit. If the opportunity is over there, you got to find a way to go and meet that opportunity.
Right. Yep. Totally agree with that. Okay. So I guess pivoting to our final question, this is going to be more philosophical, less practical. We've seen Geoffrey Hinton win a Nobel Prize, in physics. I think the DeepMind guys won a prize in chemistry. AI eating the world is definitely proving out right now. Do you have any predictions or just things that people aren't talking about in terms of what AI is going to look like in a year from now, 5 years from now? We just mentioned some of the recent news. Obviously, there'll likely be an reacceleration of that. I mean, it almost seems that physics will become AI, chemistry becomes AI. Do you have any other sort of philosophies of how to navigate the next 1 to 5 years?
I'm really excited for it, and I believe that the changes are happening at a rate where humans are still adapting. And just from the point of view of software developers, the job is changing all the time. If you are coding today like you were coding 10 years ago, you'd be out of a job. because people would say, what, you're not using code review? In many cases, you're not using source control. You're using some editor from 10 years ago. No, developers are used to constantly turning over the way that they work, even in the enterprise. And it's probably going to go a little bit faster, but it's not going to be some fundamental change. And I believe that humans are really good at always finding ways to increase the complexity of the things they build, to yearn, to demand more. And I think back to John Maynard Keynes, who said more than 100 years ago that in the future we'll be working something crazy like 5 hours a week. And that sounds absurd right now. I really believe that humans will find a way to always yearn for more, and that as AI coding tools help us deal with more complexity, more complex requirements, we're just going to build better technology that's fundamentally more complex. And so, you kind of conserve the amount of complexity in the system that humans need to deal with. And we're always going to be that much ahead of what AI can do. That's going to be the case for, at least the next 5 years or so. I think all bets are off beyond that, but I'm fundamentally optimist, and that's why I'm doing this.
Is that a world that we want to live in, though? So do we, if AI simply augments sort of our productivity, what are the second order ramifications of that? At least if your thesis holds that, we are sort of going to be working the same amount of hours, just sort of an augmented way. Do we sort of approach this futurist society of robots, working in the diner, and of essentially a convergence of everyone becoming an AI engineer or practitioner, or do we basically end up in a world that's no real different from our own world today? How do you think about what the world looks like, or maybe it's sort of an irrelevant question that is not worthy of discussion?
I think humans have been on this treadmill for the last several thousand millennia, and we are still on the treadmill. Maybe it's moving a little bit faster, but there's nothing that we can do about it. It's a collective action problem that you cannot change. And I think it's good because if you look back at any point in time over the last 5,000 years, if you were to say, no, stop this technology, 99.99% of the time, you'd be wrong and you'd be hurting human progress. And also, there's nobody in the world who can say, stop this technology. So for us to have someone in the world who is anointed with that capability is actually more dangerous than the expected value of the harms that might come from this. But, look at all the technology, look at all the change in the world over the last 100 years and all the ways that make our life better. That is the kinds of things that people are using code AI to build today. And that's what people have been using code to build. So we'll get more of that. We're going to broadly distribute it more so that coding is accessible to more people. And again, as someone who believes that humans are fundamentally good, that humans want to build and create, and I think that's backed up by thousands of years of human history, I feel like this is a thing that's going to lead to more good in the world.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Quinn, for joining us. Collector Nation, thank you so much for listening. Hope to see you next time.